Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SEO for Ecommerce Podcast. I'm Glenn, and today I'm joined by Christine Corbin from Thread & Co. Hi, Christine. How are you?
Hi, Glenn. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Really excited to be having you on today to be discussing the topic of the search landscape and how it's essentially shifting for shoppers, and also what this means in terms of GEO and also
Mhm.
brand visibility, because I've been on LinkedIn quite a few times now, and it's really been a common talking point for this entire year of 2026.
Yeah.
So it'll be really good to kind of chat on this specific topic since a lot of people have been talking about it. But before we get into all the fun stuff, if you could give a brief introduction to yourself and your background.
Absolutely. So I got started in fashion on the design side, actually. My education was in apparel design, and I had a few different corporate roles in women's wear and fine jewelry brands on the design, and then a bit of project management, bit of marketing side. And I transitioned into full-time freelance marketing and consulting about 6 years ago. And since then, I've really kind of landed in the SEO, CRO sphere, just kind of more digital marketing for fashion brands. And about 8 months ago, I launched my agency, Thread & Co., with a co-founder. Prior to that, I was fully soloist. And now we are running an agency for fashion and beauty brands, and it's been really fun.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. Yeah, and when I was looking at your kind of background, I quite liked it
Mm-mm.
because I've also worked similarly in
Yeah.
terms of fashion and beauty brands as well, just
Mm-mm.
in terms of like SEO side. So yeah, I'm quite excited to be having you on to be chatting about some of those key specific areas.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. I love getting to chat about that sector. I feel like there's not always as much attention on that sector, so it's always fun
Mm.
to do a deep dive.
Yeah, 100%. So just getting into the topic really.
Mhm.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because obviously you've worked across, fashion, as you said, e-commerce, consulting, and digital strategy.
Mhm.
From that entire experience, how has that shaped the way you think about modern e-commerce today? Because I can imagine that's definitely shaped how you look at things in general.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I like to think that because I've worked in a variety of areas in the fashion industry, I have a bit more of a holistic approach. I try to really stay informed by my design background when it comes to like UX and CRO suggestions. I really care about like protecting people's brand identity and like preserving the aesthetics of their site and keeping this like unique brand voice and like vision. And it's just been really interesting throughout the years to see like how the industry has changed and kind of be approaching that from like multiple different perspectives. And then also because I have had a bit more of like a general fashion background, I also am always really interested in like learning, and I think it's just so valuable like both for myself and my clients. Like I am at the point I'm at because I taught myself a lot of stuff and like learned from a
Mm.
lot of really good mentors kind of on the fly. So I think I try to bring that into the work I do as well and be really open to like teaching clients or like trying to be like just helping them learn and understand as well, because that's like certainly benefited my career.
Yeah, and is that kind of what drew you towards the, I suppose, fashion and beauty side of things? Because obviously that was like your background. Because I think what drew me towards, say,
Mm,
fashion and beauty was, I don't know why, but my first ever kind of SEO project when I was working agency side was with
yeah.
a fashion or health and beauty brands like skincare,
Mm,
and the branding side of it is what really kind of drew me towards it, to that specific industry, because it's one of those specific sectors where you can really kind of play with the brand and be creative. So what was it that drew you towards, I suppose, fashion and beauty?
absolutely. I agree with you. I love that sense of creativity. I think for me, in school, I studied apparel design and I really loved the actual like creation and like craftsmanship process. And I think as I started working at my first few jobs, which were at kind of smaller women's wear brands, like under 10 employees, I developed so much appreciation for really like the passion that goes into running a product based business. Like it's not easy, as you know. It's really tight margins, and it's like it's really takes a lot to bring these products to creation and get them to market and like sustain this sort of the design sensibility and the brand ethos. And so I am so impressed by anyone who chooses to run those type of product based businesses after seeing firsthand what it takes. And that's just made me like have such a love of the industry, and like I'm just so like impressed by anyone who chooses to found these type of brands. Like, it really is a passion project, and
Yeah, it's not easy.
it's not easy. And then, as you said, there's such a beautiful creative side, and like the design choices and the branding. I think you can have a lot of fun in this sector with those choices. So
Yeah, 100%.
yeah.
And going back to kind of your experience, so obviously you've seen e-commerce evolve across multiple phases now.
Mm-hmm.
And what feels fundamentally different about this current shift in search and discovery based on, say, I don't know, 5 years ago? Because I can imagine even just saying 5 years, a lot has massively changed.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot recently, because I'm just thinking, even 5 years ago, the concept of like TikTok shop, for example, being such a big deal, or people using like TikTok as like a primary search and discovery engine for products. I think we were certainly not even to that point yet. And obviously now that's become so normalized in such a quick amount of time. But to me, I think more broadly, the pivot that we're seeing with generative AI and the way people are using these engines, I don't even think we can like fully predict or know what the endpoint will be yet. But to me, it just feels like such a broad sea change. I've seen people compare it to when we transitioned the internet from desktop also to mobile devices, and that it was just such a broad change in like user behavior. And when that first started, I don't think anyone could have predicted where we are now with it, and how integral like mobile functionality and the ways our phones are so integrated. And I kind of think it's going to be a similar conversation with generative AI. Like, it's changing really rapidly. We can already see the ways it's changing, and simultaneously, I think it's going to be such a big like shift that I think anyone who says they know exactly where we're going to end up with this
Yeah.
is lying. But I think it's just a really interesting time to be working, because I think it is going to be such a broad pivot.
Yeah, and that's kind of like a beautiful segue to, I suppose, understanding or looking at brands that do adapt well to that change. Because
Mm-hmm.
even when things like, AI chat platforms being introduced early part of this year or tail end of last year,
Yeah.
to now, like so many things has rapidly changed. And obviously, when things like ChatGPT first came out, people were assuming that ChatGPT is going to be the dominant force. But obviously now, there's a lot more bigger players overtaking ChatGPT, so a lot's changing. So you have to be really adaptable. And when looking at that, what would you say separates a brand that can quickly adapt from those that struggle to keep up? Because it can be a little bit tricky to kind of identify those things.
Absolutely. I think the one thing that I'm seeing a lot of currently, as I tend to work with smaller brands these days in like a consulting capacity, it's people who are taking the time to experiment and like take time to do R&D and just play around with the tools, versus the ones who I'd say feel more overwhelmed, and so they're kind of having a more like head in the sand approach, which I totally relate to that, because as you said, like things are changing so rapidly. I think we all thought ChatGPT was going to be sort of the primary player, and obviously, like I personally am very much Team Claude if I'm going to work with any of these
Yeah.
tools that change very rapidly. But also, there's so many new tools popping up for everything, like video, audio, content creation, and
I never thought I'd use Gemini. That like I was
yeah,
so surprised. I now
yes,
I'm there.
it is pretty good. It's pretty
Yeah.
good. So I think it's like, instead of coming from a place of total overwhelm, you almost just have to pick something and just experiment with it and start figuring out how these tools work, and just like not letting yourself just like bury your head, because even though it is changing rapidly, I think people need to start getting a sense of like how to function in this new sphere and how these tools kind of work, because there are a lot of similarities between many of these tools.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like what you said, the whole testing approach, because it can be very easy to say discover a way of working with a specific AI tool or
Mm-hmm.
platform, and as a brand or as a business be like, oh, this does a job for us, we don't need to think about anything else. But now that there's always has been like constant change in marketing in general, but now that there is just an accelerated amount of change, you can't have that leeway as a business or a brand specifically now within e-commerce. You can't afford to say be too reliant on something for a long period of time without testing, like what you said. So being able to, I suppose, be flexible with in terms of discovering
Mm-hmm.
what's in the market, and then being able to adapt that into your business is something I think that's going to be the key differentiator when it comes to staying, I suppose, on top of things as a brand for sure. So that makes sense.
Yeah. And also, just on that point, I think it's like, I also don't want to imply that everyone needs to start doing everything with AI, because I think you can certainly have these conversations, especially in such like a creative industry. It's like, you can certainly have your lines in the sand. Like, I'm not implying everyone needs to be like generating all their images with AI or like generating all their copy with AI. People need to figure out what they're comfortable with. But I certainly think in terms of like back end automations, reporting, things that just like generally make your life easier and smoother as a business owner, like at minimum, you need to be thinking about those things. And I understand it's tricky and people have concerns. Like, I have those concerns as well. But I think just being educated and figuring out where your lines are, what you're happy to work with, I think is important.
Yeah, flexibility.
Yeah.
And now just looking at shopper behavior, and this is another thing that's massively changed completely.
Yeah.
How are you seeing shopper discovery behavior change right now? And are brands at the moment overestimating how linear the customer journey still is at the moment?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think we still have this idea that there's kind of this linear journey, whether it be coming through a paid ad touch point, landing on a landing page on site, and then browsing that way, or coming via organic social content. That there's this kind of journey that we can like track and really neatly attribute to one pathway. And I think it's just increasingly becoming really fragmented. This was probably even before Gen AI became more popular. But I just think that there's a lot more touch points that are appearing now. Like I mentioned earlier, we know already that TikTok and to some extent Instagram have really become more of like search engines and like discovery engines for shoppers. And then of course you have AI search, which is of course going to be giving people increasingly smart feedback based on their history. And I think we haven't even like seen the full culmination of that. And then obviously you still have like Google Shopping, you still have Amazon, you still have all these other places, and you still have to have websites as well because you need that like unified storefront. I think people still really rely on that. We're not in any way past the point of needing really great websites, but I think it is becoming more fractured, and there's a world now where people are going to hear or see about your products, hear about your brand in a couple of different places vaguely before ever actually making their way to your site and like making a final decision. So it's just it's really less linear than ever, and it's a lot of like brand recognition and a lot of like a whole ecosystem of content, which maybe wasn't always the case before.
Yeah, 100%. And you just got me thinking of a little case study before where I knew someone who was doing drop shipping. And one of the things that can be a drawback with drop shipping is, say, branding, as an example. And I think now, like what you just said, if you don't have a strong enough brand that's present across different channels, like, say, social media or a good website in this case, or different touch points, like, say, YouTube as an example, then it can be a massive drawback in terms of trying to grow as a business, especially e-commerce. And one thing I wanted to ask you in terms of like a little segue is, if you're a smaller brand, what's the best way to, I suppose, manage your resources in terms of trying to, say, be visible across different platforms? Because obviously there's so many channels now and entry points, like what you mentioned. As a smaller business, what's the best way to kind of manage that, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if I were talking to a small brand owner who had like kind of limited resources as to how they're trying to increase brand visibility, I would really be trying to gather a lot of social proof and UGC whenever possible, and really getting good systems in place, like your email flows, your SMS post purchase flows, those kind of things to try and get that social proof from customers. Reason being, I think we know that generative engines really buzz off of social proof and
Yeah.
giving people information from other shoppers. We see that they really like ingesting those types of information. And the other thing I'd probably try to do, now this can be dependent on the sector, I know it can be easier for some segments than others, but I would also really trying to be investing in video content like YouTube shorts, TikTok, all these types of things. I think it's really useful for customers, obviously. And of course, TikTok is a huge discovery channel, but also we know that YouTube content is being ingested really well by both Google and then generative engines. And that kind of increases your overall sort of brand visibility. So that's probably what I would focus on if I had sort of like limited resources, is like some content creation, focusing on video and really trying to dial in a user generated content pipeline that like keeps sustaining the brand.
Yeah, UGC is yeah, definitely important for sure.
Yeah.
Probably yeah, because your customers do the work for you in that situation, which you can work with. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And staying on buyer journey, I suppose you kind of touched on it already, but would you say shoppers are becoming less loyal to, say, traditional search engines and more, are they kind of just seeing what works for them? They're being a bit more agnostic when it comes to kind of things that they use to discover certain products or
Yeah,
specific things that they're looking for.
I think so. And I think obviously there's a lot of talk about like Gen Z and younger generations and the way they use the internet. I think we were already seeing a shift in general, like more to social as a search engine, even prior to generative AI really kind of taking off. But
Mhm.
yeah, I do think people are becoming a bit more platform agnostic than ever. I do want to add a caveat. Like, I think we know that they're becoming more platform agnostic in terms of discovery. I do think in terms of the actual like adding to cart and checkout journey, I absolutely do not think we've arrived at like peak AI saturation. I'm sure you saw that like ChatGPT had integrated this like Shopify checkout integration
Yeah.
tool. And they tested it and it wasn't very popular. So they kind of quietly rolled it back like I think a month or two ago because people just weren't really using it yet. So like I think it is interesting to note that maybe the search journey is changing and the way people discover things is changing, but I think that the way people still buy things is not changing as rapidly as maybe some would have predicted.
Yeah, I still think, like what you said, it's still in that stage of everyone uses like things like ChatGPT, Gemini, all these platforms for research, and they're not at that stage where they're ready to make that jump towards doing everything on those platforms, like saying this is the research stage in ChatGPT or Gemini, or whatever, and this is the kind of buying stage within the same platform. So I'm not sure when exactly that jump will be made, but yeah, there's still that clear distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the $1 million question.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, well, I don't even want to make a prediction because I could be wrong, but yeah,
No,
I think it's
no.
it's going to take a bit of time. It's going to take a bit of time. So, and with platforms like say TikTok, Reddit, and other say online marketplaces, and also some other AI tools, where do you think those tools and other AI tools sit within the customer journey now? I think we already kind of touched on it already, but I suppose we can look at it from further down the line in terms of where that integration could be. But in terms of what you've seen, what do you currently see?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with all those sort of different places, TikTok, Reddit, various marketplaces, I think they all can serve as potential entry points. But I also think that they can serve as sort of like research or social proof stops down the line, like especially TikTok or Reddit. So I think it's just as we said, it's so not linear anymore. But I think like for example, like let's take the beauty sphere. I think there's a world where someone sees a beauty product recommended on TikTok, they see it in TikTok shop, they see like all the commentary about like who does this work for, etc. And then maybe they hop on over to Reddit at some point because there's really active beauty subreddits there and like look at reviews. Maybe they also do research in ChatGPT or Claude and they say like what skincare products do you recommend with like this active ingredient and they get more information. So I think people are kind of bouncing around the place to kind of validate and get more feedback about if things are right for them. And then obviously with AI, it's kind of ingesting all of this data from these various
Mm.
sources, TikTok, Reddit, the brand website, press coverage, and then it's going to give people back really specialized feedback based on sort of all that information that it's taking in. So it's not necessarily the final stop on anyone's journey, but it is like just worth noting that it's kind of it's collecting
Mm.
everything in a way that maybe like traditional search didn't do. So
Yeah, I think it's why it's so important going back to what you said before about having that ecosystem as a brand because nowadays you can't really be too focused on say one channel. So say if you're doing say paid ads as an example,
mhm.
or you're just focused on your website as an example, like all these different channels need to work together. And I was funny enough, I was previously speaking to David Vernon from Search Theory agency, and he was basically saying the same thing now, where that as a brand, if you want to say appear on things like AI search platforms, you have to make sure that you integrate all of your marketing channels. So if you're say a pretty big e-commerce store and you've got different teams or different agencies working with you, you have to be able to kind of get your entire team together, get the entire separate different agencies that are working on your brand together to kind of chat through how you're going to integrate this entire strategy for each of the different marketing channels, so that obviously you kind of feed all that information, like what you said, into things like ChatGPT and other AI tools. So that's really important to kind of consider if you're a brand.
Yeah, absolutely. It does take, I mean, undoubtedly it can feel a bit overwhelming because it does feel like it takes more resources than like perhaps it used to keep track of all this.
100%. And for brands, obviously, when looking at discovery for certain products today, what do you think most e-commerce brands still misunderstand about how people discover products today?
Yeah, I think some brands are doing better than this at this than others, but I think maybe what I've seen a lot of brands not understanding is that, like, as you kind of alluded to, we really need to be paying attention to the commentary that's coming from channels that the brand doesn't necessarily own. So that could be responses to influencer videos on TikTok. Again, I keep going back to beauty as an example because I think there's so much conversation around this in the beauty sector, but there is for clothing as well. As a brand, you probably need to be seeing what influencers are saying about your products in the comments of their own video streams. And you probably need to be, especially if you're a larger brand, looking on Reddit and like seeing what people are actually saying about your brand. Not that you necessarily need to have an active presence there, but you need to be listening and absorbing and thinking about how you can use that on that language and how you can use the takeaways there to help overcome customer objections. And I think that's just maybe a bit different than how things used to be. Like, I think you just have to have a bit more of an outward focus and be paying attention sort of in more areas because you're not fully owning the conversation any longer. And that was kind of always the case since social media has become more popular, but certainly with AI and the way, like we said, it's absorbing all this information and taking this in, and what it's giving back to customers is going to be parroting this information that it's pulling from Reddit and from TikTok and from Instagram. You really have to just be on the ball with that, and someone needs to be thinking this stuff through.
Yeah, 100%. And it reminded me of a specific stat. I think I saw it on a search engine journal saying that I think the period of, I believe it was April or May, I think Reddit had the highest citation or visibility on search results as well. And also, I think it was another specific company. They did a bit of research. I think it was Prolific. I could be wrong. Could be butchering it, but they basically did a bit of research as well in terms of citations for Reddit. And you've probably already seen it as well, where Reddit overwhelmingly appears quite a lot for a lot of the specific terms that these specific brands customers are searching for. So if you can kind of use that as potentially your source of information to kind of guide, say, what you do in your content strategy or any of the specific things that you're looking to implement within your business, then that can be really useful as well. So I think that's quite important.
Absolutely. And I think you're totally right. Reddit's being so prioritized. And also, I think YouTube continues to be pretty high up there as well. So again, it's just like that whole sort of content ecosystem. You just got to be tuning in.
Yeah, 100%. And looking at GEO now, which is another thing that's been mentioned quite a lot on LinkedIn and other places. So there's a lot of discussion around GEO at the moment. And in simple terms, what does it actually mean? Because a lot of people, when looking at obviously the SEO specific industry, a lot of people have been having a bit of infighting in terms of, oh, should SEO change to GEO? There's things like AIO, LLM, optimization, all these different acronyms being thrown about. So in terms of GEO, in simple terms, what does it actually mean?
Yeah. GEO is kind of my preferred term of the moment. It stands for Generative Engine Optimization. So if we look at SEO, which is all about, optimizing your website, your content presence for like search engines like Google, Generative Engine Optimization is, in my opinion, a quite similar concept, but it's about optimizing for these large language models that are prompting generative AI. So tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. It's, in my opinion, has a lot of similarity and overlap with SEO. I think anyone who's saying it's a totally new thing or we need to throw out SEO altogether is probably trying to sell you something. But yeah, it's in the simplest terms, it's just optimizing for generative engines as opposed to only search engines, which, by the way, search engines are becoming generative engines. So we're kind of closing a loop there, but
yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of like interconnection between the two. And when obviously people say the whole thing like, SEO and GEO, and I think like what you said before, if somebody's saying, SEO is no longer a thing, obviously they're just trying to sell you something. And it can be very tempting as obviously as an SEO in this case to kind of, really push something in terms of selling towards say marketing directors or heads of marketing because they don't have time to kind of say educate themselves on this new thing that's come about when it comes to AI.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to kind of, I suppose, if you're an agency or working with specific brands, kind of guide the client in terms of better understanding what the differences are and how they interconnect. I think that's probably going to be the best way to kind of obviously showcase trust, but at the same time let the marketing directors or heads of marketing, whoever you're working with, know what the changes are. So that's quite important.
It's so true. And I think everyone is feeling, as we discussed, like so much pressure right now of like, what should I be doing? What changes should I be making? And there definitely is like that education piece that has to be included. Like, for example, I feel a lot of people, a lot of lay people, obviously in this industry, I think people know, but like a lot of lay people working in ecom may not realize that like generative engines are still largely pulling like they're crawling search engines to like present like traditional search engines to present people with information. That's not the only thing that they're doing to create answers obviously, but like the idea that we can just like throw out SEO or we don't need to care about these sort of existing ways to optimize, it's just very like short-sighted. And I think because people feel a lot of pressure and because there is a lot of conversation around how things are changing, um yeah, it is really important to educate people on that piece of like, instead of panicking,
Yeah.
let's actually look at it as like a holistic thing because that is what it's going to be. I don't think Google is going to go away anytime soon, for example. Like, that's not happening.
Yeah, 100%. And staying on that specific topic, how would you say visibility is changing in a world where AI tools summarize answers instantly? Because one of the things that I noticed, this was very early in the year, a lot of blogger sites, a lot of people that did affiliate marketing, they were the ones that were really hit quite badly with things like AI overviews and AI just summarizing things. But when looking at, I suppose, the wider scope of, say, e-commerce brands and also just brands in general who want to be more visible, just on online on search results, what would you say the changes are going to be, and how do you kind of foresee the impact of those AI tools being long term?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it's interesting with the shift, like from Google, for example, we've seen the rise in zero-click searches, which is where Google has been kind of summarizing things and feeding you back the information so that you don't have to go through to a website. And that has impacted a lot of industries, as you said. I think it's a bit different for ecom, of course, because ultimately people still, as we said, consumer behavior has not changed so drastically yet that people are still not going to the website. So there is still, and again, this could change. I don't think you or I know when it's going to change exactly, but at some point,
Yeah.
maybe buyer behavior will shift. But for now, we still see that people ultimately are going to the brand's website to like validate and make their final purchases. So like certainly visibility is changing, and as I think we touched on earlier, it's harder from a brand metrics perspective to track exactly the ways that people are making it to your products. I think that does make things difficult for brands.
Mm.
But what I think we're seeing is like it's becoming more about overall brand recognition and like either name recognition or like being really organically driven by having really great product that people want and maybe having the multiple touch points of seeing it in different places and collecting more social proof about that product. And it's becoming just more difficult to attribute like a really linear pattern of like they found me on Google, they clicked through to my website and they made a purchase. I just think we're increasingly moving away from that, and I do think it's hard to when making like data backed brand choices because we're going to have to become a lot smarter and more strategic about how we're actually tracking like brand visibility in this new landscape, and I think that's really a challenge.
Yeah, that attribution's a nightmare because I used to, a previous agency that I worked at, I used to handle the tracking setup. And obviously back then, this was like pre ChatGPT, AI stuff. And the tracking setup in terms of like setting things up was relatively easy to do. And now that obviously when I moved to another agency, I wasn't handling the tracking anymore. So I was like, oh, okay, I can focus more on SEO. And when I was looking at the changes now, I'm I think it would have been just a nightmare for me to try to set up the attribution in terms of the tracking for e-commerce, especially trying to see that entire journey. Like what you said, it's hard to kind of see that now. And I think what I've started doing now, at least from an SEO perspective, is kind of looking at tools in terms of, has brand impressions gone up? Has clicks for brand terms gone up as well? Has non-branded terms have they also seen an increase as well? So it's kind of like for the time being at least, the best workaround that I've been able to kind of use at the moment with clients when trying to showcase that, there's things like AI now in the mix, and even though we can't track everything 100%, we can at least look at some of these metrics to kind of, I suppose, see what's going on.
Absolutely. And like, totally like trying to show people through the data that like, okay, maybe click-through rate seems really impacted. And as we discussed, like there's reasons why click-through has been impacted, but like, maybe you're still holding really strong with like visibility and like impressions that you're receiving for the brand. Like that's still really important. And obviously people still want to see those firm numbers of like, well, who clicked through to the site and made a purchase. And it's like, I think, as you said, there is going to have to be that education layer of like, this is kind of how we're operating now. Like we just don't have that to some extent. And I'm also thinking like prompt tracking, it's so tricky, of course, but also I think like the longer people are utilizing these generative engines for like their own sort of product research and results, like these engines are going to get really smart about giving people hyper personalized results. And like, I wonder, just thinking out loud here, I think that's going to also be really tricky for like prompt tracking, which is still so a developing space.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of mixed opinions on it as well on LinkedIn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. I think there is the education piece of like, we have to keep optimizing for brand visibility, even while understanding that attribution and like click through and all these things are going to be like, are being really impacted. And it's tricky.
100%. You also touched on something before, just regarding, obviously I spoke about the example of affiliate marketing brands and blogger websites being hit by things like AI reviews and just AI in general, just summarizing things for people. And when looking at the brands that are naturally positioned for GEO, would you say e-commerce brands are definitely primed for that situation? Because I think, like what you said before, they're probably that's the specific sector or industry that's probably been protected so far from the recent AI changes. But from your experience, what would you say? Which brands are kind of the best positioned for GEO?
Yeah, I think we are lucky in the e-com sphere, like I said, because we haven't had traffic totally decimated by AI overviews in the same way. At least not to this point, we have not. But I think in terms of like who is well positioned for GEO, I think that the brands that are kind of naturally starting to come out ahead are the ones that were already investing in social proof, as we discussed, so important. And also just like different types of content. But I also think that the people that are kind of naturally already doing better are the people who have a lot of content on their site that's focused on sort of like overcoming customer objections. I think we can see that generative engines digest this kind of data really well. So what I mean by that is like customer FAQs, really rich like sourcing materials, care information, really good searchable customer reviews sorted by star rating, really robust like returns and shipping policies that are really easy to find. I think that type of information that always should have been best practice, but I think we just know that generative engines respond to that really well. So I think that those people are kind of naturally like coming out on top more in terms of content. Obviously, as you know, it's always kind of tricky with e-com content because we historically didn't necessarily have the same benefit of like some blogging sites. Like blogging is just not really the main pillar of like e-com brands, right? But I think that kind of like customer objection type of content, the people who invested in that are probably naturally doing a bit better right now. And for people who haven't yet, that's probably something they need to focus on.
Yeah, I always give this example of a previous thing that happened to me a few years ago, where I was working with an e-commerce brand, and I put together a strategy in terms of, this is what we're going to be focusing on, like the category pages, product pages. And I was essentially told they don't want to focus on any of that. They want to focus on blogs. And I found that super, I'd never heard a brand say that, an e-commerce brand say that. They want to just focus on blogs. I found that to be pretty funny. But what you were saying before is so important in terms of a lot of people, say heads of marketing or just business owners in general, when they want to say focus on things like SEO or any other parts of marketing, when they talk about trying to obviously now appear on things like AI search results or appear on, things like Gemini or ChatGPT, they look at it from the point of view of trying to skip the fundamentals. Whereas if you, which is kind of what I focus now on, is if you want to appear on things like say ChatGPT or AI platforms, it's you get there by focusing on the fundamentals. So in the case of SEO, as an example, if you want to say appear on things like ChatGPT, well, you need to have good content, and that happens on your website, and you need to have good schema markup. So it's kind of like what you said before, having those fundamentals in place is so important because that's what's going to get you those citations, and obviously not just focusing on your website, but focusing on other channels as well. So that's quite important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also just like good PR. I think that that's
Mm.
going to be more important than ever. Like, I really think we're looking at a scenario where digital PR is just going to become so much more important, and not in like the scammy backlinks from nowhere kind of way, but
Yeah.
like actually investing in like quality press outreach. I think that's going to become even more important.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into brand signals.
Mhm.
And obviously now that we have to think about, additional channels and additional things as marketers in general,
Mm.
what brand signals do you think are going to essentially matter the most when looking at, I suppose, the landscape now, looking at obviously heading into 2027 as well, even though we're still in 2026, but I like to think ahead. So,
Mm. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, as we discussed, there is kind of like this whole ecosystem of brand signals, like obviously your reviews, your product data, like community discussions, all these things are important. I think the sort of number one thing I would advise people to focus on is getting their product data feed really up to date and like the just key source of truth for everything. So in Google Merchant Center, really spending time getting that super optimized and filling out all that like really rich data. I saw that they actually just introduced something like I think this week called conversational attributes, which is where you can add frequently asked question information to each of your products in Google Merchant Center. You can add like adjectives that describe your products. You can add product popularity within your catalog. So you can say like, this is the like number one most popular product, and it can kind of weight things that way.
no,
Um,
I don't know about that.
it literally just dropped like a few days ago, I think. So so no one's probably done it yet, but I would say
Yeah.
focus on that. I'd say get Google Merchant Center really clean. And then I think as you
Mm.
mentioned, like schema, so important. Like making sure reviews are included in your product page schema, like really just focusing on like getting data feeds really clean. And then once you've done sort of those basics, that's when I would start, yeah, thinking more about the kind of wider conversations, like we said, on TikTok, on Reddit. And I'd really be thinking about UGC and kind of your like content ecosystem. But if you have to do one thing, it's get your product data feed really cleaned up and full of like all the information possible.
You touched on brand authority before,
Mm-hmm.
and I suppose it's connected already to things like credit. And when looking to build that authority specifically outside of your website, obviously, why is it so important? And at the same time, how can a brand go about doing that? Because I think it can be really, really important if you're in the health and wellness industry as well as fashion. Because I
Yeah,
think those sectors, they definitely need to have a strong brand. Because going back to what I was saying before with the person that was doing drop shipping before, I feel like that's completely dead now, because if you can't build a brand alongside that, then you're going to really struggle, especially as an e-commerce brand for sure.
absolutely. Yeah, brand authority, I think outside of the website is becoming more important than ever, just because, as we said, the way generative engines digest content, they're simply not looking at your site. They're looking at this
Mm.
whole ecosystem of content. And I actually was reading this really interesting article about the clothing brands that are currently sort of like winning AI visibility. And one of the for luxury brands, at least, one of the brands that's doing amazingly right now is the Row, the brand that's owned by the Olsen twins. Um,
Okay.
and it's interesting because, like, in their case, they have almost zero content on their website. It's a purposefully very minimalist, understated website because they're kind of like an icon of sort of, let's say, quiet luxury. Um, and the reason that they're doing so well in visibility is entirely in their case because of like PR. Like they get so much press from Vogue and from all these like huge brands, and so they are able to kind of like ride this visibility wave really not because of the website and really purely because of PR. So like, it just goes to show that, and that's obviously not going to be achievable for small brands, of course, but it just goes to show that there are like different paths to becoming more visible, and like PR and sort of outside authority can be a really important path, I think. So obviously for smaller brands, that's going to look different than a brand that's founded by the Olsons. But I think,
Yeah.
as you said, for like beauty and health, the brand authority can still look like user generated content, short form video content explaining the products and their benefits. Like I think that there's still ways you can approach, even if you aren't necessarily going to be able to get press spotlight in like huge publications. But yeah, you're going to want to think about brand authority from like I think multiple different avenues will be important.
Yeah, I think like what you said, I think if you can start, say, getting customer feedback and also being able to introduce that UGC, that's going to be such an important thing because I was working with a brand before where the non-branded impression and clicks on their website was quite low, but the brand was just doing all the heavy lifting. So this was obviously when we first started working with them, and I was wondering to myself, this was like, before I'd looked at the site and the data, and I was thinking to myself, why are they doing so well? And obviously, when I looked at the brand performance, it was so strong. So
Mm.
if you can find that balance to where you have a strong brand that's doing the heavy lifting, and at the same time you've got good non-branded performance for your SEO, and also good other campaigns going on through other marketing channels like paid ads, for example, then
Yeah.
that's kind of where going back to the ecosystem again, that's where you can kind of have that winning formula essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of think like the good news is, from like the examples we're talking about, it seems to me from the like brand case studies that I've seen that there are sort of different paths that you can still get to a good visibility place. Like I think maybe that's a nice way to think about it is like not everyone is going to be the row and have nothing on their site but have all these reviews in Vogue or whatever. But lots of brands can have these like different formulations and ways that they improve their visibility. As you said, it could be customer reviews, it could be video content, all these things. And so like maybe thinking of it as like a recipe that you just have to figure out like what works for your brand and what the specific strengths are to like focus in on, I think could be a good way for people to think about it.
Yeah, 100%. And looking at just briefly on SEO in terms of like tactics to implement, are there any tactics that you think are becoming less important than what they used to be, or are there any now that were not important but now at the forefront? What's kind of your take based on recent changes?
Yeah. So I think for e-commerce, we already touched on this a little bit in terms of like, not that blogging was ever maybe most people's primary strategy, but I think that that kind of focus on like long form content and trying to do a lot of like keyword stuffing in long form content, I think it's just less relevant than ever, especially for the e-com space. I just don't think that that's the kind of content that the generative engines are necessarily responding best to. I think if anything, it's like you really need to be more focusing on the user experience and creating really like skimmable content, because it's good not only for humans with short attention spans, but it's also really good
Yeah.
for these engines to digest. And I also think people are realizing that you can't necessarily just create huge amounts of content that's like maybe a little bit repetitive or a little bit spammy. Like I think maybe that use to some extent, maybe you could game the system a little bit by creating a lot of blog pages that were just slightly different, or maybe they were guides of like this versus this, but they were all kind of samey, and maybe you could get short-term results. I just think we're really moving away from that. I think all these engines are getting much smarter about what they consider spammy, what they actually consider useful to people. So yeah, I think we all just have to get a bit smarter and like actually focus on content that's useful for humans. And then I just think that that content is also what tends to be useful specifically for generative engines. But
Yeah.
yeah, we can't do, I think we can't necessarily do these like tricky tactics anymore. Not that you ever should have, but
Yeah. And yeah, I saw something as well that like Google's like de-indexing and removing a lot of pages,
yeah,
like a lot of pages recently. So that kind of bar to entry in terms of like good quality content seems to be going really, really up now, because anyone nowadays can make content, just quick chat GPT and you're good to go. So I think they're being really, really strict in terms of what's worthy of essentially being on search results.
I totally agree. Yeah.
And obviously now looking at some of the mistakes that you see brands make, from your experience, obviously since you've worked with a lot of brands, within the e-commerce space, health and beauty and also fashion. What mistakes are you seeing brands make when trying to, say, optimize for AI?
Yeah, I think as we kind of touched on a bit earlier, the biggest mistake that I'm currently seeing isn't really like one specific tactic. It's more people getting really overwhelmed by the changes and either doing nothing or thinking that they have to throw out their entire existing SEO playbook because everything is different, even though they don't exactly understand how, and that they need to like start some new strategy from scratch. That's kind of what I've just been observing with like the brand founders that I've worked with is just either like total overwhelm, head in the sand, can't do anything, or being like, throw it all out. What are we going to do now? Starting from ground zero. So I think my like main sort of piece of advice is don't do that. Continue focusing on the fundamentals that you already thought were important, but also start experimenting with these tools and also start learning, like as we said, the way that these tools do sort of bring in like a larger amount of information, and just think on maybe a bit more broader term than you were used to, but don't think that you need to throw out everything that was already working from your brand and start from scratch. I think I just say like, keep calm, everyone. It's probably my main
Yeah.
mistake I'd like people to avoid.
Yeah, I think that's why I said before that education for, say, marketing directors or business owners who are in charge or handling a, say, marketing project, it's so important for them to be up to date or be informed of the changes, because that can obviously prevent, say, extreme measures being made on their side from a business perspective,
Mm.
that can kind of affect other marketing channels. So yeah, that's really important for sure. And it kind of ties in with the section that I wanted to speak to you on regarding the commercial impact for e-commerce brands. So obviously, with these changes that are occurring rapidly now, what do you think this shift means commercially for e-commerce brands over the next few years? And I appreciate that could be a little bit tricky to try and predict, because honestly, anyone, like what you said, saying they know the answer in terms of the next few years, it's
Yeah,
very unlikely they're going to be correct. But just based on the information that we have now, what would you
of
say
course.
is the likely change potentially?
Absolutely. I know. I was like, oh no, don't make me
Yeah.
predict the future too confidently right now. No, I think as we said, so I think I expect at some point we will hit a phase where people are more comfortable with like agentic e-commerce, and what that means is having agents on your behalf via generative engines make purchases for you. I don't know how quickly we will get there. In my opinion, it's not going to be that fast because, like, just speaking totally anecdotally, that's not something I'm comfortable with an agent doing on my behalf. And that's not how I want to shop. And I don't see that changing for me rapidly. But again, as we
Not alone.
said, exactly. So that's why I don't want to put a time frame on it, because I think everyone who's saying like, oh, everyone's going to be shopping totally different next year, I just think that those people again are trying to sell you something. And my best sort of thought for what I think is going to occur is the way that we had Amazon become really important and popular, and a lot of people use Amazon. I think there was people who could have said, everyone's just going to buy everything through Amazon now. They're not going to use websites anymore. It's all going to be through Amazon. And I think people are kind of saying that with generative AI right now. They're like, it's all just going to be through ChatGPT. Everyone's going to buy things there. But I think what we've actually seen as things have shaken out is that like people use Amazon, obviously, but it did not negate the need for websites. And like I personally don't use Amazon for everything. I spend a lot of time on individual brand websites and make actually more of my purchases that way still, but like Amazon is part of my buying ecosystem. My best guess is that people are going to become much more comfortable with agentic shopping and these sort of apps that are coming to the forefront that work within Shopify, like the Shopify checkout that they tried out. I think eventually those are going to be more prevalent, but my feeling is that at least short to, let's say, midterm, generative AI is going to be like one piece of the shopping ecosystem in the way that Amazon became that. But it's not going to completely rewrite anything anytime soon. I do think in terms of shopper behavior, though, like as we said, I think that these engines are going to increasingly get really smart about recommending really personalized products to people based on their shopping history. And I do think that's a change that like websites are going to have to anticipate, because I think shoppers are going to get used to probably a higher and smarter standard of product recommendations. And so again, what is that exactly going to look like on a brand website level? I don't know, but I think that people are going to get used to that. So something's going to have to change.
Yeah, 100%, especially on the ecosystem side of things, because like what you said, similar to how people have multiple subscriptions for, say, Netflix, Amazon Prime, stuff like that. I think it will probably be the same, like what you just said, but it's just this additional thing that I can make a purchase on, essentially, as opposed to, I suppose, putting all my eggs in one basket on this one thing to make a purchase. So I think that's probably how people are going to approach things going forward when this whole AI integration of purchases starts becoming more prevalent. Just final question from me. What's one thing that you think more brands should be investing in right now?
Ooh, I'd say investing resources in content, and probably video content specifically. Again, it's very dependent on your niche. I think it's easier for some segments to do this than others. And I keep going back to beauty because I think beauty is doing so well with like video content right now. But I think investing in sort of organic content that people can find outside of just your website is really important. That was definitely always on brands' radar for like social marketing, but I think it really needs to be considered an element of like SEO and GEO now, in a way that it just wasn't before.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's funny that you say that, because Leona Story Slides, she was a previous guest when she came on. She said the exact same thing, where obviously you want to focus on the fundamental, like, technical aspects, making sure your site's in a good position to be discovered and obviously indexed by Google. But the key thing to kind of have that visibility is content. And if you don't have that going for you as a brand, then you will struggle, essentially. So yeah, even through your PR activities, that's going to be a key thing as well. So
totally. But everyone still remember to optimize your product feed. I'm not saying if you're allocating new resources, put them to content, but your existing resources, make sure your product feed works.
Yeah.
Don't forget
everything out.
Yeah, don't throw everything out. That if you take one thing away, don't throw everything out.
Yeah, no, 100%. Well, I always like to ask guests towards the end of the podcast if they're working on anything exciting. So is there anything at the moment, Christine, that you're working on that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. So yeah, as we mentioned, I founded my agency Thread & Co. It launched kind of recently. And what we offer is search retainers, conversion rate optimization retainers, and paid ads for fashion brands. So if your brand is feeling overwhelmed with all these shifts that we're talking about and doesn't know where to start, like, let me help you. Happy to do so. And yeah, I also write a newsletter. It's called Add to Cart. It's all about e-commerce and just the sort of like e-com marketing ecosystem that we're all existing in. It's focused very much to fashion and beauty brands, but I think everyone working in e-com could potentially get something out of it. So if you liked this conversation and want to hear more of my opinions, you might like my newsletter.
Oh, that's awesome. I'll subscribe to that for sure. See what it's about.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for that, Christine. And guys, if you want to learn things about SEO, CRO, paid ads, you now know where to find Christine at Thread & Co. And if you got a ton of value from this podcast episode, be sure to like and follow us. But until the next episode, we shall see you next time. Thanks, Christine.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Glenn.